Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are watching ThinkTech Asia being broadcast here from Pioneer Plaza, the heart of downtown Honolulu. And we have got an extraordinary program for you. Those of you in Hawaii, you might think you know a lot about this topic, but I promise you, you do not. We're going to have a conversation with an active duty Army officer about why keep the Pacific Command, or Pearl Harbor, why keep all this military here in Hawaii. And to help us with this conversation, I'd like you to meet Major Frank Rosenblatt.
Hi.
Nice to have you here, Frank. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, David. I'm glad to be here. And I'm here in my own capacity, even though I am, as you said, in the U.S. Army. The opinions that I'm going to talk about here are my own.
Okay. So it's his own personal opinion, not making a formal representation on behalf of the Pacific Command here. Fair enough?
Yes.
Okay. And so, Frank, just help our audience generally with what is it that your position you're an Army lawyer, correct?
I am.
And that's called a JAG?
It is a JAG. And
what does that stand for?
The Judge Advocate General. It's the biggest law firm in America, and so
okay, all right.
They do a lot of things. They prosecute, they defend criminal cases, help with divorces and other things. In my case, I work in the field of operational law, helping commanders with their military problems and engagements.
Okay, so you're really a clearing the legal hurdles for an operation type lawyer as opposed to handling personnel problems.
Yes.
Fairly stated? Okay, so give our audience an example of the kind of things that you might do.
Well, for example, out here in the Pacific, the big emphasis here on our engagements with other countries. And so as we develop these plans as to what sort of engagements are going to be a good idea, they like to run it by the lawyers and make sure that we're in compliance with our treaties and our statutes and even the military's own rules for how we do those things.
You know, Frank, the conversation I want to have with you this evening has to do with why is it necessary that we have this phenomenal military concentration here in Hawaii? And you know, folks in our audience may not, they may not appreciate, they may not understand this. And so before we get into this, how would you compare the Pacific Command sitting at Pearl Harbor with other military operations, other military bases anywhere else in the world, the United States, Canada, whatever? How does the Pacific Command fit or compare with any of those other installations?
There is really nowhere else in the world quite like the U.S. military in Hawaii. It's a place where there's an extraordinary gathering of talent and leadership and military organizations, and we're all here on the island, so we learn how to work together between the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines.
What you're saying that there's no military base like Pearl Harbor and Schofield? I mean, the whole kit and caboodle combined. Nowhere else in the world like this?
You certainly have a lot of important people in the military in Washington, D.C., but I can't think of anywhere else like Hawaii where it all really comes together between all the services and not just the services, but in how we interact with the civilian community and all the other more international presence that's here in Hawaii.
Let me ask you, because we'll go into some more depth, but what's the kind of the broad brush picture of why PACOM, Pacific Command, is located in Hawaii? Why is it here? Why not San Diego or Seattle or San Francisco?
The location, of course, makes a lot of sense. We can get on a plane or a ship and reach most of the places in Asia in a few hours. And I think if you ask most Americans to name Pacific countries, they might say China or Korea or Japan, and I think at least in the mainland, they don't consider us to be a Pacific country. In Hawaii, that perspective is different. We recognize that we're not just here for the military command for the Pacific, that we're right in the middle of it.
Let me step aside from the Pacific Command just for a second. It's, there's an old country expression. Well, let me go down a different rabbit trail, okay,
All right.
just for a minute. And I don't know what your response to this is going to be, but have you noticed that there is a different relationship between the business community in Hawaii and the military compared with the business community and the U.S. military elsewhere in the United States?
The interconnection just cannot be overstated here. I mean, Hawaii has learned from a long history. Look at the economic impacts from back in World War II, of the direct impact on Hawaii. And there's a recognition here that business interests come from the intercooperation, military and civil society and the business communities.
Well, okay, so later in the show, what we'll do is we'll take this particular issue, that is the bridge between the Pacific Command and the business community, and we'll explore that in a little bit more depth. But what I think we ought to do now is, I bet you there are a lot of people in our audience who, maybe they've driven around the edge of Pearl Harbor, on the freeway, they've seen little glimpses of it, or they've been to the Arizona Memorial, or they've seen, on a landing approach, they've flown in over the entrance to Pearl Harbor and come in over Hickam as they landed at Honolulu International. But I bet you there are a lot of people in the audience that have never really had a chance to see what Pearl Harbor looks like, right?
Right.
So why don't you and I take the audience here and let's take them on a helicopter ride.
Let's do it.
Okay, and we'll go on board a military helicopter, and you can just kind of point out what they're going to be seeing here. And so, control room, if you would fire up the helicopter, let's us get underway here. And so here we are. We're right off of Waikiki, coming around the end of the, I guess that's the Reef runway, right?
Right.
And so where are we now?
Looks
By
like we're
Hickam?
heading towards Hickam and Pearl Harbor.
Okay. And so some of you, maybe you've seen pieces of this on a landing approach, but there we go. Help me with this, Frank. What are we looking at now?
Ford Island.
Coming in Ford Island. Okay.
Look at this. Not an uncommon sight for those who live on the south part of the island.
That was in Missouri, right?
Right.
Right over the top. And is that the shipyard there? Or no, that's another... What are we looking at here? Bravo Pier? You're not a Navy guy, so,
Right.
so I know. But it a fascinating view of Pearl Harbor. And this is just a piece of the assets of PACOM, correct?
It is. A big Navy presence, an Air Force presence. And that's the side of the island we're on right now.
And here we got, I don't recognize the carrier from a distance, but just to kind of give the flavor of some of the assets that are available here at the Pacific Command for those of you who have never had a chance to see that. That was pretty cool.
Right.
All right, so we've got this incredible military presence here, and we've got a major substantial piece of the world economy coming out of Asia. And so what in your view, if you had to reduce it to just a simple broad brush, how would you phrase the kind of the general mission of the Pacific Command at Pearl Harbor here?
It's covering an extraordinary territory for the military. We like to say from Hollywood to Bollywood and from polar bears to penguins. So that's about half the world's surface covered in the Indo-Asia Pacific region, and about half the world's population as well.
So basically, let me try this on you and see if because I don't understand the polar bears to penguins type thing, but let me try this on you and see if we were to take the west coast of the United States and we went down to the west coast of South America, and that includes Alaska, by the way, and we had this big squeegee with colored ink on it, and by the way, the squeegee goes all the way down to Antarctica and all the way up past Alaska into the Arctic Circle, right?
Right.
We had this squeegee with colored ink on it, and we started wiping across the globe. Where is the jurisdictional limit of the Pacific Command on the other side? Where does the squeegee stop?
All the way over to the Indian Ocean.
Okay, so that's Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean is kind of the outer reach.
Right.
Okay, and if I run that line on a map, I'm sorry we don't have a map here, but if I run that on a line up on a map, that slices right up through Moscow, doesn't it? Or close to it.
Not most of Russia, but the ocean all the way up to the north of Russia.
Okay, and it picks up China?
And that's part of the PACOM area.
And how about Pakistan, Afghanistan? Is that area included or on the border?
No, that's not. India falls within the PACOM area.
Amazing jurisdictional reach, absolutely amazing. But let's take a different approach to kind of looking at why the Pacific Command should stay in Hawaii. And you know, there are a lot of different reasons or examples that we can point to, but maybe it would be good for our audience to look at some very recent developments in the South China Sea. And maybe we can show the audience kind of what's going on, and then we can backtrack into the connection with PACOM with that.
Okay.
Shall we do that? Okay. And so control room, if we could bring up visual number 1 for us, that would be great. And so let's start here, Frank. This is a map here in the middle of the South China Sea, and here we've got two reef areas identified. One is one called Fiery Cross Reef, and that's to the left on your screen, and to the right is one called Johnson South Reef. And what I want to do is I want to show you some pictures and kind of get your reaction to this. And so, control room, if we could bring up, we'll focus on Johnson South Reef first, okay? And this is a reef called Mabini Reef that was claimed by the Philippines. And so here's photograph number 2 here. And you can see this photograph, Frank, was shot a year ago in roughly February 2013. And you see a Chinese structure built on that submerged rocks or reef, basically. And if we go to the next photograph, number 3, control room, what you see is a reclamation effort by China on that same reef. And if we go to photo number 4, this was done just in March of this year. You can see the progress of that reclamation effort. And so if we then go to a sketch, which is photograph number 10, what you can see is that the overall plan for Johnson Reef, Frank, is to build a kind of a multi-purpose military and tourism island, reclaimed island with a harbor. And notice that there's this long either reef or arm of land that arcs off to the upper left to a place called Collins Reef, which is occupied by Vietnam. So that, you know, tremendous potential for conflict there. Mm-hmm. And on the left of this sketch, you'll see this major runway. See that? And so this particular reclamation project by China over the last few months in the South China Sea, on an island that was claimed by the Philippines, they call it Mabini Reef. Now, it's going to be some major island now. What's your reaction to this?
Well, my first reaction is surprise. As a career military guy, I always thought that the conflicts that we would be facing would be over the most populated parts of the world and their resources, and instead, the conflict is instead shaping up over these barren and developed patches of land out in the middle of the ocean.
Well, and you know, in very recent weeks, we've seen China drag $1 billion oil rig into the exclusive economic zone claimed by Vietnam, and we've looked just now at this reclamation project of Johnson's South Reef. And so, control room, if we could go back to photograph number 1 here, visual number 1. Let's now, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at Fiery Cross Reef. That's the one on the left there. And if we could go to this photograph number 5 here. This is the Chinese development of this reef. And Frank, I just found out about this a few days ago, and the Chinese planners are talking about building a Diego Garcia-like military base there at Fiery Storm Reef or Fiery Cross Reef, whatever it's called. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it's incredibly interesting to me as we, as I look back at our legal standards for this and the Convention on the Law of the Sea and how that thought about what an island would be for the purpose of an economic zone, an exclusive economic zone, and it turns out to be a riddle that if it is not habitable, then it can't have an exclusive economic zone. And of course, a lot of these islands are showing us that because it will support an exclusive economic zone, they'll find any way they can to make sure it's habitated.
Interesting. We'll have more on this when we come back after the break with Major Frank Rosenblatt. You're watching ThinkTech Asia, and stay with us. I'll see you on the other side.
Hello, I'm Martin Despang, and I'm the host together with the one and only Ali Yamashita, and our show is called Urban Transcendence. And Urban Transcendence is about identifying where we have a unique situation of a vibrant city in one of the most beautiful natural environments. So how these two can coincide, sometimes conflict, how they could find reciprocity in the 21st century is what we're excited about. And we're planning on bringing in a diverse body of guests, both from the arts and the science and the established and the wise and the emerging generation. So hope you will join us. We'll always be on Thursdays from 1 to 2 p.m.
We're back. You're watching ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, David Day, and we're talking about why bother keeping the Pacific Command here in Hawaii. And helping us with this discussion is Major Frank Rosenblatt of the United States Army. We dragged him in here from Camp Smith, and he's graciously participating in this program. And again, his opinions are his own, not representing the Pacific Command. Fairly stated? Fairly. Okay, all right. Control room, let's go back to photograph number 5, if we could. And Frank, right at the break, we were talking about this extraordinary development that's surfaced in the last few days here. This photograph came from the South China Morning Post, and it has to do with a reclamation of an island by China called Fiery Storm Reef or Fiery Cross Reef. They use different terms, and the reports are that China intends to build its own hard military base there, Diego Garcia of the South China Sea. And the South China Morning Post, they're suggesting that this particular move, this development, suggests a shift from defense to offense in the East and South China Sea by China. And if we assume, for purpose of this conversation that you and I have, that China is, in fact, going to build something like a Diego Garcia in the middle of the South China Sea. What does this have to do with PACOM?
Well, I'm not sure what China's intent is, and I'm a lawyer and not a strategist, but what I do think the South China Post and other media outlets throughout the region are talking about is similar to what Secretary Hagel was recently talking about during his speech in Singapore, a growing concern on the part of U.S. civilian leadership about Chinese activities in this region.
Let's do this. Let's go to Secretary Hagel's statements in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue just a few days ago, and let's listen to the point that Major Rosenblatt is referring to here by Secretary Hagel.
One of the most critical tests facing the region is whether nations will choose to resolve disputes through diplomacy and well-established international rules and norms, or through intimidation and coercion. Nowhere is this more evident than in the South China Sea, the beating heart of the Asia-Pacific and a crossroads for the global economy. China has called the South China Sea a sea of peace, friendship, and cooperation, and that's what it should be. But in recent months, China has undertaken destabilizing unilateral actions asserting its claims in the South China Sea. It has restricted access to Scarborough Reef, put pressure on the long-standing Philippine presence at the Second Thomas Shoal, begun land reclamation activities at multiple locations, and moved an oil rig into disputed waters near the Paracel Islands. The United States has been clear and consistent. We take no position on competing territorial claims, but we firmly oppose any nation's use of intimidation, coercion, or the threat of force to assert those claims. We also oppose any effort by any nation to restrict overflight or freedom of navigation, whether from military or civilian vessels, from countries big or small.
Boy, pretty strong words there by a major civilian leader in the United States. What's your reaction to that?
Well, my first reaction is this is a military I'm glad to be a part of. It hasn't always been like this out in Asia. You used to have General MacArthur back in a few decades ago, and what I think we're seeing is that the shots being called in the U.S. engagement throughout the region are not being made by a general or admiral, but it's coming from our top military leadership. And I think what the role of PACOM is to, and all the military organizations out here, just to try to give options and advice to try to support what our civilian leaders want to do.
You know, ladies and gentlemen, we wanted to show you Secretary Hagel's comments because this is an opportunity, I think, for the public to see actually the United States face-to-face, nose-to-nose, intellectually, on some of the moves that China is making. So you can see the confrontation that was taking place in Singapore there. And what we couldn't show you was immediately prior to Secretary Hagel speaking, Prime Minister Abe from Japan made a very strong statement to the Southeast Asian countries that were present there, the ministers of defense and so forth, that, hey, you know, we're here to help you, you know, Japan is back. And the representatives, the PLA from China were all kind of red-faced and realizing that, you know, some of their moves are not terribly appreciated. And so Prime Minister Abe's comments, kind of a poke in the eye to China, were followed by very strong statements by Secretary Hagel. And you know, the PACOM connection between Secretary Hagel's comments, and this comes to the reason why PACOM is here in Hawaii. As you see it, what's the PACOM or the Pacific Command connection with Secretary Hagel's tough talk?
Well, military partnership is going to be a big part of that, and our ability to discern intentions of these actions that can be perceived as hostile, and maybe not just with, this is just one example with these Chinese actions in the South China Sea, but how well we understand each other and we can communicate with each other, and how well we can avert misunderstandings is so important to this. So this is certainly an issue that has, I think, a lot of attention, and but to me it comes back to how good we are with communicating, interrelating with other nations' militaries.
Okay, and a piece of that, Frank, correct me if I'm wrong, but a piece of that is you have, your big boss stand up and make some pretty tough statements. And the $64 question is going to be whether or not those statements are going to be backed up by action, is it not? Or whether or not, I'm sorry, not actually backed up by action, but whether there is a perception on the part of the Chinese that those statements will be backed up by action.
Right.
Now, one of the things that is important in the region here is the free flow of trade and navigation through the Straits of Malacca and up through the South China Sea. And we've talked about these reclamation of these islands and potential for building military bases. Do you see a potential challenge in the future to the U.S. maintaining freedom of the seas with that type of development?
I think you've hit it exactly at what you're getting at, that tie between the economic security and the security sector and what the military is doing. And that reminds me of something else that Secretary Hagel mentioned in that speech. He talked about as the South China Sea as the economic heartbeat of much of the world, including America and our trade through there. So those security concerns are deeply intertied with our economic rationales for our presence and for our security interests in the region.
I guess it was a couple of years ago, I was kind of surprised to see there was a conference, I don't recall the name of it, in Hanoi, and the Chinese were taking the position at that conference that their 9-dash line, their claims in the South China Sea were part of their core interest. And the use of the term core interest to the Chinese means what? Do you know?
I'm not sure in this context.
Okay. In that context, my understanding of what it means is that that's something that a core interest is so central that they would go to war over it. And at that same conference, I was quite surprised, and this was 2 years ago, I was quite surprised to see a rather strong statement made by then Secretary Clinton that really got the Chinese fired up, where she said that the freedom of navigation through the South China Sea was in fact a core interest of the United States. And I don't think the Chinese, were expecting that. And this statement by Secretary Hagel is even more confrontive or aggressive. I don't know, aggressive is not the right word, but clearly, the two heads are intellectually are going with the Chinese moves, and Secretary Hagel's statements are, we saw on video here, they're nose to nose, if you will. And that nose-to-nose configuration, the Pacific Command is going to be called, or is called, to play a very important part in keeping that from exploding, or if it should explode, to handle the problem. It's reason number 91 for keeping the Pacific Command here in Hawaii, isn't it? Something like that.
It is. What a complex challenge.
Very, very complex. When we come back after the next break, we're going to talk about the interesting significance of the Pacific Command here in Hawaii, having to do with business. And what is that bridge between the military and the private sector? And we'll do that on the other side of the break, so stay with us.
Hi, my name is Dr. Rafi. Every week, I'm right here at ThinkTech Hawaii, 3 p.m. on Mondays. My show is Boards' Bio Briefings. What do we do here? Well, we watch sperm swim, we see if they catch anybody, we check out the latest biosimilars, you know, the kind that, what was his name, the guy with the bicycle? I guess we forgot his name, but he was taking EPO and other human growth factors. We'll be talking about human growth factors. You want to know where to get some? Maybe I'll tell. Anyway, you can catch me, as I said, every week right here, Monday, 3 p.m., ThinkTech Hawaii, Dr. Rafi. You can also find me on Twitter, BioInfoMedical. Or you can catch me on Facebook, Dr. Rafael Boritzer. I'll be happy to converse with you. Aloha.
You're watching ThinkTech Asia, Why Keep the Pacific Command in Hawaii with Major Frank Rosenblatt. And here we are with some hardware. Pacific Command being shown off here. Just a quick little taste for our audience. But right before the break, we were talking about this nexus between the private sector or business and the military. And to kind of get this conversation started, let's go to World Economic Forum in Manila, where we've got your Admiral Locklear talking to a group of government and private sector, as well as military leaders from the region. And so that would be video number 9, control room, if we could go to that.
Business to go on, there has to be this underlying security architecture of some kind. We need to spend more time looking at what is happening in the military side of things in Asia. The rapid growth of militaries, the rapid growth of military equipment, much of it offensive in nature, history would tell us if those are improperly used, that will destroy that security fabric to the point that business can't go on. It cannot go on. And when that comes, then we got a big problem in Asia, where 7 out of 10 people in the world are going to live.
There you go. That was Admiral Locklear's explanation of the potential for, without having the Pacific Command, the need for a security peace in the region. Otherwise, you destroy, in his words, the security fabric, and business can't operate. Reaction?
Well, I think he's being a realist with what the Asian Pacific region requires, that nations can't go it alone. This isn't an arms race where we're all stockpiling. He's concerned about that, and I sense that he's talking about how we can cooperate to meet security challenges. I mean, and the security sector is just one of them. In Asia, you can't solve things like pandemic disease, cyber terror, cyber crime, terrorism, or anything else, or global climate change with nations going it alone. So by working together with other nations, he's trying to bridge those gaps in the security sector.
Let's take one example, Frank, of a work that you folks do at PACOM that maybe our audience isn't fully aware of, cognizant of, and it happens from time to time, but they don't realize that I think you've got teams that focus on this all the time, and that is the just one example of all those things that you mentioned in the area of humanitarian assistance or disaster relief, and so we have in this region the volcano ring of fire, and problems in terms of volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, and we've seen the damage that can be done with the Great Tohoku earthquake in Japan, the whole Fukushima reactor situation, or the tsunami that hit Aceh in Indonesia some years back, and other examples. And a lot of times I think the civilian sector, they think on a daily basis that the Pacific Command is a war-fighting machine. They're there to, blow up stuff, and not build it. And do you see this other function as something that's ongoing on a daily basis as well?
It's a huge part of what the military structures here are involved with, and dealing with the challenge of when these disasters occur, who's in charge and how do we coordinate it between nations. And this reminds me of something that the Foreign Affairs magazine wrote about last month, Kurt Campbell, talking about the pivot within the pivot. We've maintained a forward military presence in Northeast Asia, he argued, but that is now shifting down to more where the disasters are actually occurring. We now have the presence in Darwin, Australia, the littoral combat ships in Singapore. So I think this is just sort of the logical thing in the U.S. military's ability to coordinate and to respond to disasters and making it more relevant to what's actually happening in the region.
You know, I had a really fascinating conversation some months ago with a governor of one of the major prefectures in Japan. And this gentleman spoke fluent English, PhD from Oxford, and not really the typical Japanese politician. You know, he was more of a scientist, but a very forward-thinking leader. And this Governor Kaakatsu was telling me that, you know, before the Great Tohoku earthquake and the whole Fukushima incident, that the Japanese people, number one, really did not understand, nor did they appreciate the U.S. military presence in Okinawa, what that meant for them. And then at the same time, they had a similar attitude towards their own self-defense forces. You know, they didn't really respect them. What good are they kind of attitude. And he said that after that earthquake, because of the incredible coordination, partnership, and drive in this, what was it, Operation Tomodachi. Pretty good for a civilian, huh?
Very good.
That Operation Tomodachi, that with watching the U.S. military work smoothly with the Japanese self-defense forces, he was telling me, he said, you know, David, for all of the negative media that we had in Japan having to do with the way that the power company handled it or the way the Prime Minister's office handled it, the one thing that came out from that was a total change in attitude of the civilian population, of the respect and the need for their own self-defense forces. And he said, by golly, the appreciation for having the U.S. Marines there at Okinawa to assist and support was just, the difference was profound as a consequence of the humanitarian relief and the whole effort that was done around that situation. So the disaster relief aspect of the Pacific Command is actually a powerful example, I think, of American soft power. You know, you're using hard power assets, but in a people-to-people humanitarian type way. You know, you're using helicopters to move bottled water instead of helicopters to move rockets and whatever.
You're absolutely right. It's a tangible benefit that people see when otherwise, you know, we do what we can to try to be good neighbors. This is something where there's a direct benefit, and it's powerful, and that's, you know, some of the example of what the rebalance is really about. We're not going to be able to see on our news screens, military forces surging to Hawaii or anything, but we do see more of that soft power, people learning the language and being more involved with the communities, and that really aids us when we do have to get involved with the humanitarian assistance and disaster response.
You know, one of the things that I've had the privilege to observe is the relationship between, you know, again, tied in through PACOM, but the relationship of the Hawaii National Guard to the armed forces in Indonesia. And when we come back after the break, we'll talk a little bit about this unusual sister state partnership between Indonesia and the state of Hawaii and the Pacific Command and some of the things that have been done there when we come back. Stay with us.
Hello, I'm Martin Despang, and I'm the host together with the one and only Ali Amashta, and our show is called Urban Transcendence. And Urban Transcendence is about identifying where we have a unique situation of a vibrant city in one of the most beautiful natural environments. So how these two can coincide, sometimes conflict, how they could find reciprocity in the 21st century is what we're excited about. And we're planning on bringing in a diverse body of guests, both from the arts and the science and the established and the wise and the emerging generation. So hope you will join us. We'll always be on Thursdays from 1 to 2 p.m.
We're back. You're watching ThinkTech Asia. I'm David Day. We're talking about why keep the Pacific Command here in Hawaii. And helping us with this discussion is Major Frank Rosenblatt from Camp Smith here. And again, he's talking to us in his personal capacity. This is not an official spokesperson for Camp Smith or the Pacific Command, right?
Right.
Right before the break, Frank, I mentioned this this partnership between the Hawaii National Guard and the Indonesian military. And my understanding of how that relationship came to be was the Indonesian military specifically requested that their partner organization be the Hawaii National Guard, which is tied in as a, I don't know, can I call it a subsidiary organization of PACOM? It's under the Department of Defense there somewhere, something like that.
Well, when the Hawaii Guard activates, then they become part of the team.
Okay. So what I wanted to share with you is coming back to this comment that this discussion that you were having about the business reason for the Pacific Command here, and we tie back to Admiral Locklear's comments that there's a lot more to the military-civilian possibility that we are working on here in Hawaii. And as you said at the beginning of the program, Hawaii is very advanced in terms of other places in the United States in terms of this military to civilian or private sector connection. And one of the interesting things that I had an opportunity to observe was that the Hawaii National Guard does frequent humanitarian work, missions, training in Indonesia with the Indonesian military. And so one of the conferences that I went to here in Hawaii, it was most unusual because what was happening was the Hawaii National Guard was doing a briefing or a teaching, if you will, to the Hawaii private sector on what they were doing to build trust and build relationships in Indonesia. In other words, there was an attempt at trying to say, okay, these are the lessons that we learned. Here they are. We hope that helps you with your business. And I don't think that type of sharing, cross-pollination exists anywhere else in the United States between the civilian sector and the military sector. And to me, as a private sector guy, I think it's powerful, and I think the presence of the Pacific Command here adds immeasurably to Hawaii's firepower on the private sector side.
That's so true. I mean, look at how well aligned, like what our military organizations do with all that's here in the East-West Center, the leadership on Asia Studies at the University of Hawaii. I know about their law school and how impressive they are with their legal leadership. And you, David, you're like the Benjamin Franklin of ThinkTech and all of your involvement with many of these organizations.
Well, thank you.
So couldn't agree more.
One of the things that I think is important to kind of work down the home stretch on this program is you mentioned this whole notion of the pivot or the rebalance. And how about explain that for the audience? What is that all about for those who don't know?
Well, my take is that it started with pivot. I think Hillary Clinton called it a pivot in a 2011 article, and And pivot to me suggests maybe moving out to somewhere that you're not normally at. So then they move to rebalance, which I think makes a little bit more sense and is a better description of what we're trying to do. Doing something that's back on our turf rather than a foreign adventure.
Okay, but for the audience, explain what is the rebalance?
Well, we are realizing that that things that interest Americans, like civil rights, democracy, those are big in Asia. Freedom House just rated Asia as the only country that's been improving in that in the last 5 years. Our economic interest, by the middle of this century, half the world's economic output will come from here. So it's not a zero-sum game, but it's, you know, the future of American prosperity lies in our involvement here.
And that brings us right back almost full circle to Admiral Locklear's comments that the military presence, the security aspect, is really the foundation that allows business to succeed.
Right.
Let me try an analogy out. You see how this works, okay? You know, oftentimes I'm called to explain to people in the private sector, business people, well, you know, what is really the role of the military? Mm-hmm. You know, is it to go out and blow up stuff, break things, or you know, what's the real purpose in a free society of our military? Because we do have a whole section of our society that's very isolationist, and I think that if you have an international mindset, the way that I visualize it is that the world of business, doing business across an international border where you're dealing with different cultures and different laws and so forth, is somewhat akin to like a football game. And if you think of the business guy, or CEO, if you will, as the quarterback of a team, okay? And in some places that it's necessary to use what we call running backs to create a hole, or to create a foundation, to create a place to run to. And so I always like to think of the military as like the hardcore running backs or blockers, the downfield blockers, if you will. And so what their job is to run down into another country and help. I'm not saying knock somebody over, but you get the analogy I'm trying to make, that they're actually trying to create the opportunity, whether it's by a tackle or a block or something else, so that the quarterback can then throw a pass to his executive VP who's running downfield in whatever that country is, and the executive VP and the operations in that country have a chance to be successful and do business. And you can't have that success without the other. In other words, you can't win a football game unless you got some downfield blockers, and that's what PACOM really is. They're downfield blockers for the American private sector.
And to open up the most possible opportunities for our leadership. Can I borrow your analogy?
You can.
Okay.
You can. You know, I really appreciate you taking time coming out from behind the chain link fence there at Camp Smith to talk with us today. It's just really been fun. It's been fascinating, and I hope all of you have learned something too. And Major Frank Rosenblatt, thank you so much.
This was a pleasure, David. Thank you.
We're out of time. You've been watching ThinkTech Asia. Stay tuned. I'll be back tomorrow at 4 o'clock with an interesting program having to do with currency and foreign exchange rates. I'll see you then. Good night.